Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the January Public Forum discussion hosted by the Dog of War. My name is Jesse Meyer. I'm a debate coach. I guess I was a debate coach out of Iowa. I'm not actively coaching anyone at this current time, but I currently live in Iowa. I do a lot of work with the NYC UDL and Tab Room. I'm here as the host for this evening and the person who will be leading this presentation. With me, you have my co-host and my partner in crime, Mr. Joe Rankin. Mr. Rankin, if you'd like to introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, no problem. My name is Joe Rankin. I am the head coach at Bettendorf High School. Been here for 21 years now and haven't been fired yet. So going to keep going until, well, retirement or hopefully not the latter or the former. Anyway, I will be here for the chat warrior portion of this. Jesse will be saying words of wisdom. I will be basking in the glory of those words, as will you. And if there is anything that I find to either help him out or to cause mischief, I'll be typing it in the chat. And if you have any questions, concerns, thoughts as things go through, please feel free to ask during his talking points and just type it into chat and I'll do my best to answer it. Or we will save those answers for Jesse directly toward the end of the presentation because he probably knows more than anyone else. So we'll leave it at that if need be. But I'll try to help out during the chat portion and assist as I can.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Rankin. Hold on one second. I want to double check this. I had some issues. Can people hear me all right? Like, is my voice coming through or is it good? Okay, I had a weird situation. A couple weekends ago, I was hosting a judges lounge for a tournament and my voice had got set to my Bluetooth mic and it was all garbled, but thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, by the way, this is the first of our two topic lectures for the early winter topics. So this is the January Public Forum discussion. On Thursday, we will be hosting the January-February Lincoln Douglas debate topic over nuclear weapons. We will reverse the roles at this time. Mr. Rankin, being the all-star LD coach, is going to be taking over the discussion of the LD topic. And I will be the person who gets to read the chat and answer questions and tell you my opinion on nuclear warheads. So if you have LDers that are interested or you are a coach of a program that also has LDers, stick around and at the end we will go ahead and drop that link into the chat so that you can invite your LDers to that meeting as well. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and get started. Like we've so this is going to be the January Public Forum debate discussion. The resolution on the screen here is resolved. The People's Republic of China should substantially reduce its international extraction of natural resources. This topic, when this was written back in April, and to kind of give you an overview of how this works, the topic committee writes resolutions in April, and then they are finalized before nationals, and then after nationals we release all the topics. We write these without regards to what we think is going to be happening in the future. We don't know what's going to be happening. We write things that we think will still be timely. In the year 2025, with the world being what it is and politics being what it is and whatnot, sometimes it's hit or miss. So this topic, one of the key things whenever you're working with a resolution is remembering that this topic was in our minds and was on our radar back in April. And since then, the world has changed. The important thing is to remember that what's important is to try to make this topic relevant to the things that have gone on. Now, this topic still very relevant today. There are topics coming up in the spring for February and March that sometimes you might have to stretch a bit. But always remember, when dealing with resolutions or even extemp questions for that matter that have been written by the NSTA, they're written well ahead of time, so it's important to make them timely. Now, the one thing that I like to cover with this is the idea that the resolution really is divided into two separate spaces. The first space is kind of the top level debate, the debates that everyone is ready for, that everyone is, going to go for. And that's kind of debating about China and its resource extraction. And we're going to discuss some of the key terms in the next slide. But really, they're going to debate what the resolution says up front. The one thing that I would like that as a student or as coaches is to be thinking about is what is the deeper underlevel, the undercurrent that really the resolution is based around. This is going to be a really fun thing to discuss in early January when we look at the February topics, because they deal with more than just gambling or gun control. In this case, once we scrape aside resource extraction, once we scrape aside natural resources, once we kind of put all this aside, what we really find out and I know this might seem a little either cliche or kind of the duh answer, but it's what is the role of China in a modern globalized world? Okay, because at the end of the day, everything kind of revolves around like, what is China's proper role? And how has the role of China changed going back to the 70s and 80s till now? And so we're going to talk about some of the wording of the resolution and some of the nuances that you could play with. But then we're going to look a little bit at the history of China, its resource extraction, and how that leads into modern times, so we can get a better understanding of where do these arguments get their roots and how we manipulate history in order to make our arguments the best that we can. So first, before I begin, this is brought to you by the Dog of War Debate Company. We are focused on what really matters: our education, our development, our responsibility, and our growth. We offer a full serve slate of items for both students and coaches. So I just wanted to throw that out there. This is a business that has been kind of a passion of mine, and this year I made it a reality. So it's brought to you by Dog of War. So some key definitions and some key things to understand. And I'm just going to preface this with, I'm a tea debater. I debate topicality. I like looking at the wording of resolutions, and I like trying to figure out how can I break the resolution? How can I find glitches? Okay. I'm the kind of person that if I have free time, I look at, Pokemon speedruns and how can I break the game? And when I look at debate, I look at the words and figure out how can I break the resolution? And so these the words that I'm about to describe to you, I want you to use these as a starting point. These are some things that either A, you can play with, or two, things that you probably need to be looking out for, because there will be teams that will try this as well. So the first thing is these are basic definitions. In the packet that I will send out after this presentation by Thursday, we kind of go into a little bit more depth there. But natural resources, basic definition is materials from either ecological, biological, or geological processes used for economic benefit. So things like minerals, fossil fuels, forests, water and water reserves, sand is a big one. Any sort of, animal product. Things that you should think about when it comes to this and when you're looking for definitions, is what does this include? Can you use this to constrain your opponents or to broaden your base? So, so the tea debater in me would look and try to find definitions, and these exist. I found a couple that say that natural resources, no, they don't include lumber, they don't include timber, or yes, they'll focus first and foremost on biological things. So things like water reserves, things like fisheries and forest land, things that that they only deal with. That they don't deal with geological items, so no coal or oil or fossil fuels. These are some things that you would want to look at, because if you were using this strategically, you could use it either A, to say, no, you read a bunch of terms on how lumber harvesting is a positive for China. No, that's not part of what natural resource is, so your arguments don't matter anymore. Or you could say, actually, opponents, you are talking about how about fisheries, and fisheries aren't considered natural resources. I know that seems weird, but a lot of these contextual definitions allow for that, and you can play around with it. Resource extraction. So the industrial removal of raw materials like minerals, fossil fuels, metals from Earth's crust through mining, drilling, and quarrying. You could also go with harvesting. So you've got fishing fleets, you've got water purification centers. So what do we mean to use? Can we avoid negative impacts through sustainable extraction? So one of the things that people talk about is, or that people could talk about is the pollution aspect. That when we go in and we strip mine, we blow up the top of a mountain and we harvest the coal, or when we go and we do deep sea fishing and we harvest, 85% of the world's species of some, Finding Nemo character, and it almost goes extinct. One thing that you could look at is finding ways to make that sustainable. You could argue, and that's one of the things you could do, is argue that that China's shifting towards more modern, more ecologically friendly, sustainable extraction methods, so their arguments don't apply. The other is international extraction. So resource removal activities conducted outside of a nation's territory by firms and headquartered in another state or as part of a global economic network. This is one that actually I've had a lot of fun talking about. For those that debated either the Belt and Road topic several years ago now, or we're debating on the, the semiconductor topic last fall, if I'm correct, or a couple falls ago. One thing that we have learned is that what constitutes Chinese territory is kind of like watching siblings fight in the backseat of a car. All of a sudden, it's what constitutes Chinese territory. You could argue that based upon, and let's look at the bottom, the lens of how we view this. This is not a U.S. actor as a topic. This is viewed through the eyes of China. So viewed through the eyes of China, one could argue that the South China Sea is not international to China. They firmly believe that that is their territory. Likewise, when we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI, when China sets up resource mining operations in, let's say, the Congo or in, Peru, they believe that that is part of their sovereign territory, the same way the U.S. believes that, like, a military base or an embassy is sovereign territory of the U.S. The Chinese consider those sovereign entities. They consider that domestic. So there are ways that if you were to essentially role play within the public forum debate space, the idea that Chinese territory that there is almost no international extraction, you could get kind of almost at a point of maybe abusive definition that says, like, no, there is, all the stuff that you say that we should end is actually Chinese extraction. That's domestic. Now, I want to preface that with that. You probably want, again, I come from a very policy background. These kind of tricks that you're going to play, some judges are more willing and receptive to playing with these definitions than others. The important thing to know is that if you're debating in, let's say, the state of Iowa, and you're debating in front of like a parent judge or a volunteer judge, you maybe either have to change your strats ever so slightly, or you need to change it, or you need to really explain it. If you're going to, let's say, the Columbia tournament in New York, or the Seattle U tournament, or something, you are probably going to have a bigger depth or bigger pool of judging, so you could probably play with the definitions more. The important thing to remember is that these are just suggestions. Always take your judge and judge adaptation as the first and foremost part. So historically, and it's important to know, and this is where I get to be history teacher, Jesse, is that for as long as humans have been able to form basic tribes and nations and city-states, resources have always been at the forefront of not only expansion, but also the cause of the vast majority of wars throughout history, as well as the rise and fall of many of the greatest countries throughout history. China is no different. So we go back, one of the key focuses of China, and the reason why China was considered a desirable territory, going back decades, was the fact that large swaths of it were undeveloped and contained a plethora of resources. And we would really see this as you start moving up through the 1960s and 70s, as China settles into their role as a communist state. The communist government really starts realizing that these resources are valuable and that these resources have worth, and that they allow China, despite the fact that there are countries around the world that would like to isolate them because of their political beliefs, it makes them a large player. During the 1960s and 70s, you start seeing that this actually becomes one of the greatest things that gives China the ability to branch out, was the fact that the resources they controlled were valuable, and that through taking stands on who they would sell to, it allowed them to have some political clout. For instance, despite being a fellow communist state, the water temperature between the USSR and China was not always the warmest. So by giving the Soviets kind of a cold shoulder, it allowed China to really kind of cozy up, or at least open the doors for the West. But during the 1970s, we really see kind of a shift in how in China. Prior to this, China was a developing nation. China was modernizing their military, but they were still considered at best a second world nation. They did have access to nuclear weapons, but the ability of them to use them with any sort of accuracy was greatly diminished. They didn't really have the military delivery vessels that, let's say, the USSR, the United States, even countries like France or England had. So really, they were still considered a second world country. During the 1970s and 1980s, you see a change. 1959, Mao Zedong technically steps down as president of China. However, he's still kind of there running things in the background. During the 70s and 80s, you start seeing China really wanting to bring things in alignment. They felt that their country had been drifting too far to the side of Western capitalism, so they tried to rein it in. This was called the Cultural Revolution. This is where they tried to essentially wipe out the old world and kind of reboot themselves, kind of redefine who they are as a communist state. And one of the things that they realized that they needed to do during this time was to create their own identity, was to modernize. During this time, during the late 70s and the 80s, especially as you get into the late 80s and closer to the 90s, the writing was on the wall. But it had become obvious to a lot of political scholars, both in the US, the West, and China, that the Soviet Union was not going to be long for this world. And they realized that any support that they were getting from their kind of tentative relations with the Soviets would not last much longer. So they realized we need to expand. We need to grow. Part of this revolution, part of the Cultural Revolution, was an economic reform, was becoming independent, and that meant, creating more things domestically. So during this time, there were economic reforms set to accelerate industrialization. This is when China really started becoming a large player in the international manufacturing game. So they started expanding rapidly, and they started, taking advantage of their coal reserves, that some of their their lumber and timber reserves, their fossil fuel reserves, and they started growing. But they began to hit a wall, realizing that at the rate they were growing, it was not sustainable. During this time, China was growing at a rate of 10% economically per year, 10% industrially every year. That's unsustainable for a lot of countries. That's hard to kind of keep your foot on the gas. So they needed to branch out. Through the 90s and into the late 90s, they began a strategy of what was called going out, a strategy where they realized that they needed to create resources from other countries. And it was more than just buying the resources. It was more than just creating trade agreements. They needed to get their hands dirty. They needed to be the ones mining. They needed to be the ones involved in extraction. They saw what other nations like the United States had done, where if we needed something, we didn't let other nations get it for us. We said, no, don't worry. Just as long as this, let us set it to a base here. We'll go ahead and mine the uranium or the cobalt or the oil or coal that we need. So they began launching a program of state-owned enterprises, businesses, industries that would then go out to other countries saying, hey, listen, we would like to drill for oil, we would like to mine for coal, we would like to scout for, resources in your country. How much do you want for this? You don't have to do a thing, just let us set up, we'll be fine. They began getting investments, they began moving out, and China began using this to really fuel their industrial needs. During the 90s, you would really start seeing products on store shelves that said made in China becoming ever so prevalent. Early 2000s, China would become real. This is when they would really start seeing a boom. Right around the late 90s, early 2000s, you would see them really becoming kind of moving out. They would, some economists would even start flirting with the idea that maybe they were becoming a first world country. They would become the largest importer of resources at this time, especially for resources that they did not have access to. A lot of these resources would be considered things like the rare earth minerals, REMs. They would start acquiring large operations, so oil rights, gas rights, logging rights worldwide. And in 2013, President Xi Jinping would create one of the cornerstones of what he would hope would define his rule, the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI. It would expand access dramatically to China's ability to get resources, and we're going to talk more about this a little bit in another couple slides. They would begin giving out large piles of cash, investments in other countries, building airports and railways and seaports and roads and signing trade agreements, in exchange for them being able to set up essentially bases of operation in countries. Today we look at the global footprint today, that China operates one of the largest resource extraction networks across the continent. That they have networks or ties to countries everywhere except North America. They really don't have any bases of operation in Mexico, Canada, or the US. But basically every other continent except for Antarctica, China has access to. 60% of the world's cobalt, which cobalt is a necessary mineral for the production of batteries, especially those deep cycle batteries used for EVs or power plants. China has access to 60% of the world's supply. And their resource network now spans 7,000 kilometers from the oil fields of Angola, lithium in South America, timber in Southeast Asia, food resources like cattle and pork from South America, soybeans. One of the things that we saw with the Trump tariffs was that China has now bought, billions of dollars worth of soybeans from South America. So China has now created kind of a network where they have feelers into every country around the world for resources. Mr. Rankin, are there any questions in chat, or does anyone have any questions that you'd like to go ahead and ask out loud while we have a little bit of a second break?
Nothing so far, but I have just been popping in some articles here and there when you're going over something.
Thank you. So some examples of their extraction empire. So you've got African oil fields. One of the things, especially for developing national development, is a dirty process. And for those that have been coaching for a while, we know that especially those LD coaches out there, we have had many topics about environmental protection versus industrial revolution. We know that when a country is moving through the stages of economic growth, there is a phase of what we call dirty development. Where you don't just start out with a nuclear power plant or solar energy, that you generally have to start out burning fossil fuels, and a lot of it. So things like the African oil fields are really rich in terms of what China needs, because they don't have a lot of they don't have or have exhausted a lot of their domestic productions of fossil fuels. One thing that I didn't put on here that I think is important is that as China modernizes and tries to go more green, or at least more sustainable, One thing that is really important is the African supply of uranium, which is necessary not only for the development of nuclear power, but could also be useful in the development of future nuclear technologies, especially as we become especially as confrontation and tensions with Western nations build. Central Asian natural gas, especially from like the Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan region, natural gas is still one of the most widely used energy sources in the world, even within the U.S. So Central Asian gas has become very, very important to China. Actually, that is one thing. I actually have friends that are currently either studying abroad or currently living in China. I have friends that are coaching in Southeast Asia, and one thing that they found really surprising when they moved was the fact that of how many things are run by natural gas. And I know that seems weird, but a friend of mine, for instance, that is teaching in Shanghai, is really surprised that there are almost no electric stoves. Almost everything is natural gas. Finally, you have the interest in Latin America. So you've got billions invested in Venezuela and Brazilian energy sectors. You've got loans tied to oil. This has definitely been in the news as President Trump has taken a hardline stance against Venezuelan oil. It is potentially going to bring in the Chinese into the equation, knowing that they've invested and they have, several large oil drilling operations within those countries. So critical mineral dominance, this is where China really feels like they are, where they have kind of a commodity or a monopoly. Again, 60% of the world's cobalt is within their control. Why are these important? So we've got things like cobalt and copper are in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. These are necessary for lithium batteries, for electric vehicles, for electronics, for computer tech, both for the batteries as well as the wiring and the internal components. China has 60% of the cobalt again, but they also are creeping up on having 50% of the copper resources. And copper is incredibly expensive, as we've heard when we got rid of the penny. It costs about 3 cents to make every penny, and that's even using just a small amount of copper. You've got things like nickel and bauxite, which, from my understanding, is actually a mineral necessary for making aluminum. I'm a history teacher and a debate coach. I am not a chemist. I'm trusting the experts on this one. But nickel, again, is necessary for making electronics and batteries, as well as mining, bauxite being used for aluminum production, which is necessary for a lot of industrial purposes, for commercial use in things like packaging. Lithium deposits. Lithium is incredibly important. Coming from South America is incredibly important for, again, not only just battery use, but also for use inside things like computer monitors and touch screens for our electronics. And China controls the supply. It wants to control the supply chain. Okay, they want the vertical integration. They want to be able to control everything from extraction all the way up through refining and manufacturing. They kind of come down to realize, like, well, there are certain things that we can't necessarily do, but at the very least, we want to be the ones selling these natural resources, these refined minerals, to the highest bidder, rather than having, if we can't manufacture it all, at least we're going to be the ones selling it. And really, if you look at the most valuable minerals around the world, yes, gold, silver, and platinum are still kind of the gold, the not for a pun, but the gold standard for investments. But it's fast becoming that things like cobalt, lithium, and other rare minerals are becoming the next biggest thing to invest in. So now we move on to the Belt and Road Initiative. So how is China doing this? What is giving them the advantage to be able to do this? Well, one of the things throughout history that China did, it was essentially the first Belt and Road. We probably know it better in our history textbooks as the Silk Road. not to be confused with the black market website that was created several years ago. And apparently, I think the guy that created it just got out on a pardon. But yeah, it's not that. It's not the illicit drugs and guns and other stuff website. It was literally a road that connected the port cities and major industrial centers of the mid teens, the early 8th century through 12th century China to the rest of the world, where Chinese traders would literally go out and create, essentially paths that would be well traveled. They would create these networks, with stops along the way to every major city and every major outpost from the east coast of China all the way into Europe and the Middle East. China realized, and again, this is under Xi Jinping, that this was a value, that this is something that they could do again. And the Chinese realized that, especially through the early 1990s through the 2000s, that they had amassed a huge reserve of one thing: money. And so Xi Jinping, the president of China, had convinced businesses, Chinese enterprises, to go out and to work with not only the Chinese government, but the governments and other the governments of other countries. So they would go to, the government of the Congo, or they would go to the government of Turkey, or they would go to the government of Ukraine, and they would say, "Hey, we are an emerging power in the 21st century. We realize, we have a lot of goods that could do, and a lot of resources that could be used by you. You have a lot of things that we would like as well. Let's make a deal." And so they originally would create trade deals to trade the, products, mined in these other countries with China, and China would create agreements to sell their goods back. And to expedite this and to sweeten the deal, China would offer up large sums of money to these nations to help build the infrastructure that would allow them to literally transport these. So whether that was a new seaport, whether that was, building harbors, whether that was buying new, investing in shipping, whether that was building new airports, both for both for international travel for passengers as well as for cargo, whether that was literally building actual roads. One of the projects that is currently being worked on now, it took a couple years off because of the global pandemic, but it is back on, is literally building a road that would connect Beijing with Eastern Europe, an actual paved road. And by doing so, China would invest, I believe when this was a topic a couple years ago, at the time it was some $1.5 trillion had been invested in building this infrastructure. Now, the downside is a lot of these loans that were given out, or a lot of these contracts that were given out, were extremely predatory. They created debt traps, which basically meant that I kind of equate it to a payday loan, where once you take it out, you're kind of locked in and there's almost no escape. So countries that got involved with this all of a sudden realized that they were more tethered to China than they possibly could think. And so by doing this, China created a lot of infrastructure to transport raw materials out and goods out. And they created the infrastructure to help mine these resources. A lot of the oil and natural gas extraction in Africa were created through the Belt and Road Initiative within the last 15 years or so. A lot of the international extraction that has been created through out of South America and Southeast Asia was created through the Belt and Road Initiative. So infrastructure loans, creating financing for roads, ports, railways, power plants, really worked. One of the things that China has done, especially when it comes to uranium, is offering to help build nuclear reactors to help power South America or African countries, to help kind of give them that boost into green tech. But at the same time, one of the byproducts is fissile material that can be used to build, weapons. So there is kind of a double-edged sword. It's one of those, there's no such thing as a free lunch. They would get extraction rights over, over minerals, and they would get favorable, and they would gain political influence, whether that be through, kind of a goodwill gesture, you helped us so much, whatever you need, we can get it, or through kind of a manipulative stance of, hey, remember that you have $100 billion in loans, which is more than your country produces in GDP in 3 years. It's kind of, so it's either through essentially, you could argue a semi form of bribery to a semi form of extortion. So one thing that we look at, and one thing I want you to look at when you discuss resolutions, doesn't matter this topic or any other topic, or even topics that are in other debate events, I think that we need to look more. We need to view this as though we are policy debaters. And I know for some of you out there, you sense a disturbance in the force when I say that. I think that it's good, though, to think of this as what happens if we had a plan tax. Now, we don't have plans. I'm not advocating for a change in that status, but pretend that the resolution is a plan and that China does back down on the resource extraction. We need to think of what then happens based upon, the what ifs. So what is the effect of voting AF? What does the world look like? The old question a policy debater would ask is, close your eye, judge, this is what the world looks like in 30 years. This is what the world looks like in 5 years or in 6 months. So one could argue that there would be ecosystem protection. Deforestation would slow down. We would have less pollution from mining, because mining itself, even if it's clean, is still kind of dirty. There would be the Belt and Road would definitely be slowed. And one thing we learned on the Belt and Road topic going back, man, it must be over 7-8 years now, is that, building this new infrastructure is also very dirty. Community health would be improved because of not only pollution reduction, but also just because the work that it takes to mine, to extract, it has a toll on humans. It would also push sustainable development. It would also, host nations would also be given the opportunity to develop, to be able to step in and say what is best for their country. So I'm going to take a drink of water. Do we have any questions or any comments or anything people would like to talk about? Anything in the chat?
We talked about it a little bit, Jesse, that the mindset issue. I was wondering, like, if we were doing this, if this said the United States should do this, we would look at it from a mindset of how does it help the U.S.?
Yeah.
Should we be looking at this as how does it help China?
Yes, and that goes back to, and that's a great thing to point out, Mr. Stevens. That goes back to looking at the question I asked back on the definitions page. Who do we view what lens do we view it through? Again, the actor is China. Okay, the United, and they're going to be, that's one thing to think about. And again, I know this is a little bit more progressive in the PF land, but we have to look at it, though, as not as if China was going to be doing this themselves. Okay, as if China was the actor and they said, if Ping said today, we're going to stop our resource extraction, we're going to reduce it, what happens? Because countries never do things unless there's a benefit for them. Okay, no action is completely malevolent, or is completely, the word escapes me, but is completely without, is completely fair, I guess. LD words are hard, but you all kind of get what I mean, that no country does it unless there's a benefit for them, a benefit for their country. So especially if you are looking at this from China, and the fact that Ping has to answer, or Xi Jinping has to answer to the Chinese Congress, which, even though they haven't really had much of a backbone in enforcing, the Chinese Constitution, or at least they're willing to modify it, if they decide that his actions are detrimental, they will remove him. So yeah, you have to be thinking is like, if China is going to go, so what would be best for China? So maybe talking about ecosystem protection, unless you could argue that is something China really wants, and there's research out there on it. Everything is going to be kind of flared or kind of seasoned with the idea of, like, deep down inside China, what is China's end goal? What are they getting in as a positive? Which then gives a negative ground to say, like, well, if every action China takes has to be done with what is good for them in mind, then we have to be waiting for the other shoe to drop. We have to be waiting to say, like, okay, what's the catch? China's not doing this because they're interested in total global harmony. They're doing it because they think it gives them a leg up on the U.S. or Western Europe or the other global economic groups. So what we're explaining here with the environmental impacts is simply like what would happen in a general world if China did do it. And you could argue that maybe China wants to do this, especially when it comes to maybe community health because of pollution. But you have to be thinking, it's like, well, do they really want to protect the ecosystem? How could we spin it? Yeah, great point, Mr. Stevens. Like, we have, you view it through China. That's how I would view it. That's how I would coach my kids. There will be teams that will debate the resolution as a whole, and they'll just say, well, should China, or should they not? And they'll debate it as though it were a truth statement. Yes, no. Either side is good or bad. Again, I'm a little bit more progressive on that in that standpoint. Any other questions or comments? So kind of a quick, we've already kind of, the concept of sovereignty. So environmental, so things that are, by reducing extraction, sovereignty would be gained by the nations that are kind of taking back their own resources. One of the things is that, yes, when the DRC allows China to, strip mine the country, they do gain economic benefits, but there could be so much more if you didn't have to deal with the middleman. Improved governance within these countries, because again, a lot of these countries essentially are becoming pseudo puppet states of China because of the deals that have been done. Along with the economic cost, we've got environmental protection and revenue and job loss. That is one of the con arguments, is that both for the countries that are having their resources, used, as well as for China. Resource extraction has a lot of work that China brings in, either through the processing or the manufacturing of the end goals. And that there are trade-offs. Again, this is kind of a visual to kind of show what I've talked about. One thing that you could argue, and this is something that China would be kind of looking at, should be something that could be seen for both those that want to view it through China versus a statement of truth, is supply chain disruptions. Because there are a lot of things that if China were to back down on resource extraction, that things that they make, there would be a supply chain hit. EV production, and not just electric vehicles, but batteries. So so a lot of our electronics that use batteries or storage. One thing that we don't realize is that U.S. power plants, in order to have a reserve, use a lot of batteries for temporary electricity storage. That's one thing that we don't realize, is that electricity, once it's created, you've got milliseconds for it to be used. Otherwise, it's gone. That's why power plants are constantly dancing on a fine line of overproduction versus underproduction. A la, the Texas blackouts of a couple years ago when Ted Cruz decided to go to Cancun. Electricity has to be used, instantly. Giant batteries are a way to kind of hedge back against some of that energy loss. But we lose, battery manufacturing faces shortfalls. For electronics, which means that, things like our iPhones, our Androids, our laptops could be hit by supply chain issues. Along with the concept of EV, you have other computer components. For those that build their own computers or try to buy electronics during the pandemic or shortly thereafter, we all saw what it was like trying to buy a new end gaming graphics card. I know Mr. Rankin was upgrading his system at the time, and he saw what graphics cards jump by what, Joe, like at least double the price, if I'm correct.
Yeah, at the time it was due to Bitcoin mining more than anything. And now that kind of stuff has shifted because of AI. Hard drive prices are starting to go down, but RAM prices are going up. So all of the things don't really matter too much, because no matter how you slice it or dice it, it's still China, China, China.
Yep. Renewable energy, again, a lot of the materials that are being mined also go into renewable energy. Especially knowing that, right now I think there's only, 3 countries that are not in the Paris Climate Accords, if I'm correct. But renewable energy is one of the big things. So we would see a hit in terms of both solar cell use, wind turbine production, because the generators that are used in turbines would be hurt. And we have to think about how would this affect the world? Like, and I go back to Iowa because that's where I'm from. Is we look at, if we look at this as being 1,000 miles away. And that's one thing about these debate resolutions is that, especially these international based ones, is that it's really hard to put yourself in the mindset of what's going on across an ocean. But if we make it applicable to Iowans, we look at solar and wind projects. Well, what if they're cut? Well, right now, Iowa is one of the, I think, 46% of our electricity is manufactured by a wind turbine. We have one of the biggest wind turbine factories literally in oh crap, my brain just went out. What's the either Rankin, Krell, what's the wind turbine plant in Iowa? Where is that? My brain just blanked.
Greg saying Newton.
Yes, Newton, Iowa. Thank you. Yeah.
It's Newton.
Yep. The Newton, Iowa plant, that is one of the largest manufacturing centers of wind turbines. And this is going to sound corny, you don't get a community college in Iowa that gets a spot on a Duracell battery commercial for their use in wind turbines because they're bad at it. The Iowa Lakes Community College was on a Duracell commercial talking about, the batteries that power your gaming, your handheld gaming console are the same, on a larger scale, are being used in this wind turbine. Duracell's there for you. You don't get that kind of national exposure because you're not known for it. So what would happen to Iowa jobs? If you were debating this as a resolution as whole, you could argue that renewable energy, you could argue that if China did this, how would this affect Iowa? Well, we would probably see a large loss in our base income. Not only that, manufacturing. So we don't realize how much these minerals and these resources are used in our everyday stuff. Even down to the clothing we wear, especially for the nylons and polyesters of the world, we can't get by with it. And the vast majority of our products come from China. Electronics, machinery, consumer goods. We are venturing into a gift giving season. Lots of things are, what would that happen to the supply chain? And again, we saw this coming out of the pandemic when it was just shipping. Now imagine that shipping, we've got shipping restored, but all of a sudden we're making half of what we normally did, or a third of what we normally did. There'd be some geopolitical realignments that would be going on. So from a Western perspective, reducing Chinese monopoly, again, debating as a whole, we could talk about reducing Chinese monopoly over critical minerals, lowering geopolitical tensions over resource competition. This is one thing that we talk about it in the guide that the packet that's going to be sent out. There isn't a slide on it. I just thought I could talk about it. And for those that have been debating for a while, we've talked about this a lot, is the South China Sea. China, a lot of our rare REMs, rare earth minerals, are found underwater, in the South China Sea. China's been building artificial islands in the South China Sea in order to mine these and claim that it's their minerals. So, and there are several flashpoints that could happen between not only the U.S. and China, but also countries that exist within that realm. So lowering the geopolitical tensions, South China Sea, lowering tensions with South America, especially as we move into what's next with this conflict in Venezuela. We have an opportunity for global cooperative governance, kind of bringing things back to net zero, so that everyone is kind of we don't feel that someone like China's getting kind of an advantage. And it would also kind of quell some fears on skepticism about China's long-term commitment, like what is China's end goal? Because right now, again, a lot of what China's doing is being masqueraded and kind of dressed up as, we want to help people, but really there's ulterior motives. For developing nations, there would be a loss of one of the largest investors. One of the reasons why countries sign on for this, even those that know about the harms of like the debt traps that they could be in, is that they just need money for modernization. Okay, if China comes and offers to build you a seaport and invest $100 billion or $200 billion into your country, it's really hard for a country whose GDP is at the bottom of the totem pole to say no to that. And that would be gone. You have economic destabilization in resource-dependent states, so all of a sudden you kind of have turned off the spigot. China, all of a sudden now the network no longer exists. So if countries want resources, now they have to go out and create the networks themselves to mine and extract. That takes time and money. And that's something that nations don't necessarily have on a short notice. You have power vacuums filled by as China kind of backs away from these other countries. And a lot of places, China was one of the things that was keeping these nations stable and keeping the peace. You remove that factor, and all of a sudden you have a power vacuum. And depending on how dependent a country was on China and the money that they were getting, you could see a variety of like internal political strife. This could be something that pushes some of these nations where governments are not necessarily the most stable, or if the governments can't provide for their people, maybe there would be some sort of coups. From China's internal perspective, and I create this chart, I like it because it kind of reminds me of Maslow's theory, going back to we're doing LD like it was 1999. Starting at the very bottom, China. If you look at the hierarchy of what China's perspective of what China needs in order for their country to survive, in their mind, they have to start with a base of sovereignty and development autonomy. One of the big things is that, especially coming out of the 90s, is that they did not want to feel like they were being guided or they were being directed by any foreign country. They wanted to be their own. This is why, this is partly the reason why they didn't get along all that well with the Soviets, is that they felt the Soviets and the premiers of that at the time, so people like Khrushchev and Brezhnev, pronouncing that Russian name horribly wrong, they felt that they were being manipulated, and they didn't like that. So if they do actions, the actions, one, do they maintain their sovereignty? The second is that they want to maintain their legitimacy and employment. So, people in power want to stay in power. It's the line from Star Wars when Anakin's talking to Palpatine in the opera. People in power want to stay in power, and they want to maintain the legitimacy. They don't want to be seen as shams. They don't want to be seen as weak to their own people. Will the actions taken by China by stopping their resource extraction, unless they spin it, will it make them look weak? Will it keep them in power? And this is for more than the Xi Jinping. It's for a lot of members of the upper ruling party. Will they maintain competitive? Okay. China, yes, they have, some incredible large number of manufacturing around the world, but will that sustain itself? They can maintain their industrial competitiveness because they also, again, control a large amount of this resource extraction. They want economic stability and growth. One of the things that they love to tout when it comes to the competition with the U.S. and Western Europe is that we are growing faster than you. We have more money than you. Look at us throw this, look at us throw our money around. Look at what we can buy. Look at what we can modernize. This is all, so they want to maintain this stability. They want to maintain this growth for the top reason, and that's national security. China really began modernizing their both military, their weapon systems, their air force, their blue water navy, because they had the money to do so, because they, battleships are not cheap. Cruise missiles are not cheap. A million person army is not cheap. New guns that weren't built, AK-47s that were built during 1947 are not a sustainable weapon system. They need new ones. If they do this, how will it affect our national security? These are 5 things, starting at the bottom, moving up, that China needs to be reassured of before they take any action. And so on the con side, you could argue that, listen, China takes actions based upon their need for national security. Backing down from their resource extraction harms their national security, or China wants to maintain as an industrial competitive nation. Backing down from this harms their ability to be industrially competitive. They would never do it. Or Xi Jinping, by backing down, would lose his legitimacy. Sure as hell, he's not going to do it. So some pro arguments we'll cover.
Wait.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Why do they have to do it? Why is that an argument?
Say that one more time, or could you rephrase, Mr. Stevens?
Why is that an argument? It's like a fiat argument, isn't it? Yeah, China probably won't do it, but should they? To me, it's like, this is what China should do.
That is one way to, I think that is a legitimate way of looking at it. This is just one way of looking at it. This is one way that I wanted to give people in order to shape negative contentions is how will this, is that essentially, let me put it this way, this is a way to build the impacts of what would happen if China did something. So maybe not necessarily thinking of this as should China do something or would they do something, but well, if they would do it, which one of these lists, which one of these items would be harmed? And then can we build an impact off of that? So if China did do something, it would hurt their industrial competitiveness. What would that mean for what would an argument look like? Or it would hurt their political legitimacy. What would happen? Well, Xi would be overthrown and there'd be a power vacuum. So maybe I think that's a good thing to point out. I think maybe a better way is to look at this as if they did something, which of these five things would be harmed, and how would that then transcend into an argument chain? I think that is a better way of looking at it. And that's a good thing to point out. That's one of the things that, like, there's, the concept of fiat is, the what would happen versus what, because, and I think I will say this is when you look at any debate resolution, the act would almost never happen in real life. So you have to use fiat so I think that's a very valid point, Mr. Stevens.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. I keep coming back to the China, looking at China and where could they decrease their resource extraction that fulfills this chart. That to me becomes the real strong offensive position. Not sure I have an answer yet, but I think that's one that I'm going to look at.
That's the thing. Like this is one where I've been kind of racking my head for the last week or so as I've researched this topic. Is that on the neg side of things, it's this. It just, on the pro side of things, this seems to be a concentric topic, is what I'm trying to get at. And I think I'm in the same boat as you, Mr. Stevens. So I agree. Because again, I mean, unless you debate this again as a true statement, like should China, debating as what would happen if China did this, if we view it as, if we do what a lot of debaters will do and view it as a lens through what would China, why would China do X? I think it becomes increasingly hard to say that Xi Jinping would ever want to vote pro. Unless he was being super manipulative and there was some sort of trump card we didn't see him have. Thank you for pointing that out and bringing that up. I'm going to get some water. Anyone have a question or comment?
Yeah, the only on front, Greg, thing that I would say on that front is China has been placing itself as the leader on green tech and green revolution and trying to position themselves as a leader on that front. And the only default position that I can think of off the top of my head would be that substantially reducing international extraction would be a way to help international relations and international partnership. That would probably be the strongest route, at least on face, with this chart still being true.
Yeah, I'm looking at doing fishing too, so I think that might be an issue.
And that's an argument that I really like. I kind of like when I've been helping people with or talking with students that contact me, some former students. I tell them it's we need to go, especially if you want this topic, go outside of the REMs, start talking about the lumber, the fish, the other natural resources. I've been looking into, and a kind of a cool thing, and this requires some definitional mumbo jumbo and wizardry, is H3 mining on the moon and asteroid mining. Because technically those are still covered by international treaty. The United States has agreed not, the treaty on moon sovereignty, that no one owns the moon, that technically is decided through not a space treaty, but a international treaty that just affected space. So some pro arguments, and this is kind of just looking at the resolution as a true statement. We've got environmental protection, so reduces deforestation, water contamination, biodiversity loss, sovereignty restoration. This goes into kind of some neo-colonial stuff. I'm actually working with a student of mine who just got her master's in IR about doing some work on the concept of China as a colonial interest in this regard. I'll be releasing some new materials on that as we move into January or through winter break. Governance improvement. So, it kind of helps them reduce corruption, increase legitimacy, geopolitical stability, again, backing down from major conflicts around the world, and becoming an innovator, trying to find alternative ways around not having all the things that they need to make the stuff that they want to. And I'm moving a little bit faster now. Again, all of this will be laid out in the PowerPoint that you all will get, as well as the guide. Because we're running on the time, I don't want to keep you all too long. So, con arguments: we've got economic devastation. Again, what would happen if China did this? Would their economy be hurt? Probably they would be severely hurt. Climate transition harm. This links kind of hand in hand with economic devastation, but China is one of the world leaders in creating climate transition, especially within their own country. The ability to create new, solar cells, new wind turbines are the products to make them. So how would this handle the transition? Again, tied kind of hand in hand with economics. And the Chinese economic crisis, how would it be, again, with, dealing with fiat, if you assume that as soon as we vote pro, this happens, what would happen to the Chinese economy? How would they deal with all of a sudden not having 60% of the world's cobalt access, only having 10 or 15%? Sovereignty concerns, again, power back, would it, this one is kind of, I should kind of modify, but like, how would this affect their sovereign territory, their sovereignty? What kind of power vacuums would be filled in? What kind of legitimacy would be had within their own country? How would Xi Jinping be viewed? How would the CCP be viewed? Would this kind of lead to and one of the reasons why economics is kind of at the forefront of anything, and power vacuums are always a concern, is that whenever people are put in economic hardships, you always, especially if it becomes dire, especially if there's no end plan, especially if there's no way out, especially if you're a country as big as China, where you've got billions of people, anytime you put people into a situation of economic pain, the longer it goes on, the longer you run the risk of some sort of government overthrow, whether that be through an organized uprising, whether that become a coup, whether that become the ruling party voting you out of, removing you from power. Some frameworks to look at. Frameworks on this topic, knowing that most people will be, at least the primary framework I think a lot of people will be using, is the concept of the lens of China. So how would China view it? You have others. So things like utilitarian calculus, so the greatest good for the greatest number. Environmental sustainability, what best provides ecological benefits. International stability, what best promotes the stability of the world. Economic welfare, through, keeping the world stable. And again, all these can be viewed through China, but these are, if you're not going to view things through China's eyes. And finally, global justice, again, kind of the neo-colonial, the moral frameworks, the exploitation, the bribery, the corruption.